Sometimes the smallest hands hold the biggest hearts. When 8-year-old Naya sees a starving wolf that everyone else fears, she doesn't see danger. She sees pain that mirrors her own. In the dusty town of Dry Bend, an old trader puts up a sign, "Take any dog for free." The townspeople laugh at the mangy strays, but Naya walks past them all and kneels beside what looks like a dying wolf. The creature doesn't growl. It just looks at her with tired eyes. As she begins nursing it back to health, the town's oldest, resident 73-year-old Silas Boone recognizes something in that animal that makes him remember things he's tried to forget. Old stories start surfacing about spirit wolves and broken promises. What happens when a child's kindness forces a whole town to face the truth they've been running from? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over Dry Bend, Arizona territory in the autumn of 1887, casting long shadows across the settlement that had sprung up like a stubborn weed in the desert floor. The town existed because of the railroad, though most folks wished the tracks had been laid somewhere else entirely. It was the kind of place where hope came to die under the relentless sun, where dreams got buried in the alkali dust that coated everything from the church steeple to the children's faces. On the eastern edge of town, where the last ramshackle houses gave way to endless scrubland, stood a small adobe dwelling that most of the townspeople pretended not to see. Here lived Joseph Running Bear, 71 years old and bent like an old mesquite tree, with his granddaughter Naya. The child was small for her 8 years, with dark eyes that seemed to hold depths far beyond her age, and hands that moved with a gentleness that made grown men uncomfortable. Joseph had been watching the trader's sign for 3 days now, ever since the weathered white man had hammered it into the ground near the saloon. "Take any dog for free," it read in crooked letters, and Joseph knew it meant more than the words suggested. He'd seen signs like this before, back when the soldiers came through, offering things that weren't theirs to give. "Grandfather," Naya said, settling beside him on the wooden step that served as their front porch. She held a leather pouch in her small hands, his medicine pouch, though she didn't yet understand its significance. "The animals by the sign look hungry." Joseph nodded slowly, his weathered fingers tracing patterns in the dust. The medicine pouch had belonged to his father and his father's father before that. It contained sacred items passed down through generations, a piece of turquoise from the sacred mountains, tobacco blessed by the elders, and a small bone carved with symbols that told the story of their people. Naya was drawn to it, had been since she could barely walk, though she'd never asked what it meant. "Many things in this world look hungry, little one," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "Some hunger for food, others for things that cannot be eaten." The trader, a man named Ezekiel, who'd shown up 2 months ago with a wagon full of supplies and stories nobody quite believed, had gathered quite a collection of strays. Most were typical frontier mutts, the kind that survived on scraps and learned to stay invisible when the kicking mood struck the local drunks. But among them, lying apart from the others in whatever shade could be found, was something different. From their porch, Joseph could see the creature clearly. It wasn't a dog, though it might pass for one to eyes that didn't want to see clearly. The wolf, for that's what it was, lay still as death, its grey fur matted and dull, ribs showing through, its coat like the framework of an abandoned house. Its breathing was shallow, laboured, and Joseph wondered how long it had been since the animal had eaten. More troubling was the way it watched. Dogs looked at humans with hope or fear or the simple expectation of food. This creature watched with something else entirely, a patience that spoke of waiting for something specific, something important. "Tell me about the spirit wolves again, grandfather," Naya said, her fingers unconsciously working at the leather ties of the medicine pouch. Joseph's chest tightened. He'd told her those stories to preserve their history, to keep alive the traditions that the white world seemed determined to erase. He'd never expected her to see the connections others missed, to ask the questions that kept him awake at night. "Long ago," he began, his voice taking on the rhythm of the old stories, "when the world was younger and the spirits walked more freely among us, there were wolves that served as bridges between the living and the dead. They came to earth when great wrongs needed to be set right, when the balance had been disturbed by violence or betrayal." Naya nodded, her dark eyes fixed on the distant animal. "And they chose special people to help them. They chose those with pure hearts," Joseph said carefully. "Those who could see past fear to truth, past anger to justice." Across town, in the boarding house above Murphy's Dry Goods, Silas Boone sat on the edge of his narrow bed and tried to forget what he'd seen 3 days ago. The wolf had looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment Silas had been 23 again, standing in the smoke and screaming, watching Apache families run from the soldiers he'd led to their winter camp. Silas had been a scout then, proud of his ability to track and hunt, to read signs in the wilderness that other men missed entirely. The army had paid him well for those skills, and he told himself he was serving his country, bringing civilization to a wild land. He'd never asked too many questions about the orders that came down from above, never wondered too hard about the definition of hostile when applied to women and children. The wolf's eyes had been yellow, ancient, and completely without mercy. Looking into them had been like staring into a mirror that showed not his face, but his soul, stripped of all the justifications and rationalizations he'd built up over 30 years. His hands shook as he lit his evening pipe, a habit that usually calmed him, but tonight only made him think of other fires, other smoke. Through his window he could see the trader's sign and the animals gathered beneath it. Most of the townspeople had already taken their pick. The Johnsons had claimed a spotted mutt for their youngest boy, and the widow Henderson had adopted a small terrier that would help keep the rats out of her grain stores. But the wolf remained. And so did little Naya, who had been visiting the animals every day since the sign went up. Silas had watched her approach the creature with the fearlessness of innocence, had seen her speak to it in whispers he couldn't hear. The wolf, which should have growled or snapped or simply died from its obvious illness, instead grew calmer. In her presence, it was wrong, all of it. Wolves didn't behave that way, especially not around humans, and children, especially Apache children, should have the sense to stay away from dangerous animals. But Naya seemed drawn to the creature as if by invisible threads, and the wolf responded to her attention like a flower turning toward the sun. Silas knew he should warn someone, should tell the trader or the sheriff or even old Joseph Running. Bear that his granddaughter was playing with something that could kill her with a single bite, but every time he formed the words, he remembered those yellow eyes and the weight of judgment he'd seen in them, and the warnings died in his throat. Instead, he found himself watching from his window as Naya made her daily visits, carrying scraps of food and a small water basin. She would sit beside the wolf and talk to it in a mixture of English and Apache, her small hands moving gently through its matted fur. And slowly, impossibly, the animal began to improve. The first sign was its breathing, which grew deeper and more regular. Then its eyes, which began to clear and focus with an intelligence that made Silas's skin crawl. By the end of the 3rd day, the wolf was lifting its head when Naya approached, and something that might have been hope began stirring in its yellow gaze. The townspeople noticed, of course. Dry Bend was too small for secrets, and the sight of an Apache child nursing a wolf back to health was exactly the kind of story that spread like wildfire through saloons and churches alike. Most of the talk was dismissive. Indians and their mystical nonsense, children who didn't know better than to play with wild animals. But underneath the mockery was something else, a discomfort that no one wanted to examine too closely. Martha Clemens, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the town's moral center, had been the first to voice what others were thinking. "It ain't natural," she'd declared over Sunday dinner, her voice carrying the authority of someone. who'd never doubted her own righteousness. Wolves are meant to be wild, not pets for savage children. Mark my words, this will end badly. Her husband, a soft-spoken man who'd learned the value of silence during 20 years of marriage, had merely nodded and continued eating his roast beef. But privately, he'd begun carrying his shotgun when he walked to his store in the early mornings, and he'd started avoiding the eastern edge of town where the Apache girl and her grandfather lived. The sheriff, a practical man named Williams, who'd seen enough frontier justice to last several lifetimes, had made one attempt to address the situation. He'd ridden out to Joseph's house on the 4th day, his intention to warn the old man about the dangers of letting his granddaughter play with wild animals. But when he'd arrived, he'd found Naya sitting cross-legged beside the wolf, her small hands cupped around something invisible, while she whispered words in a language he didn't recognize. The wolf's head was raised, its ears alert, and it was watching the child with an expression so human it had made the sheriff's horse shy and whinny in distress. "Evening, Joseph," Williams had said, his voice carefully neutral as he dismounted. "Sheriff," Joseph had replied, rising from his step with the careful movements of a man whose bones had seen too many hard years. "What brings you out this way?" Williams had gestured toward Naya and the wolf. "Folks in town are concerned about the animal. Wolves can be unpredictable, especially when they're sick or injured." Joseph had studied the sheriff's face for a long moment, and Williams had felt himself being weighed and measured by eyes that missed nothing. "This wolf has not harmed my granddaughter," the old man had said finally, "nor has it threatened anyone else." "Maybe not yet," Williams had said, "but wild animals are wild until they choose not to be," Joseph had interrupted gently, "just as civilized men can choose to be savage when it suits them." The words had hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither man wanted to explore. Williams had touched his hat brim, mumbled something about keeping an eye on the situation, and ridden back to town with the uncomfortable feeling that he'd been the one under judgment. Now, as the sun set on another day in Dry Bend, the wolf was sitting upright for the first time since anyone could remember. Its coat was still dull, and its frame still thin, but there was strength in its posture and alertness in its gaze that suggested recovery was possible. Naya sat beside it, her grandfather's medicine pouch cradled in her lap, speaking in whispers that carried no farther than the animal's ears. "She has the gift," Joseph murmured to himself, watching from the shadows of his doorway. "The spirits have chosen her." It was both a blessing and a curse, this sensitivity to things others couldn't see or understand. Naya would grow up walking between worlds, serving as a bridge between the living and the dead, the seen and unseen. It was a heavy burden for anyone, let alone a child who should have been worried about nothing more serious than learning her letters and helping with the daily chores. But the spirits didn't consult human preferences when they chose their servants. They looked for purity of heart, for the ability to see past surface appearances to underlying truth. They looked for souls strong enough to bear witness to injustice and wise enough to choose healing over revenge. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Naya rose from her place beside the wolf and walked back toward the house. The animal watched her go, its yellow eyes following her movement until she disappeared through the door. Then it settled back into its watchful position, alert and patient as a sentry waiting for dawn. Inside the house, Naya carefully placed the medicine pouch on the small table beside her sleeping mat. She could feel the power within it, old and deep, and somehow connected to the wolf that waited in the darkness outside town. Tomorrow she would visit again, bringing food and water and the gentle touch that seemed to ease the creature's pain. But tonight, as she drifted toward sleep, she dreamed of running through moonlit landscapes with a pack of silver wolves, their howls carrying messages she almost understood, their voices calling her toward a destiny she was only beginning to glimpse. The wolf had been leading her for almost an hour, moving with a strength that shouldn't have been possible just a week after it could barely lift its head. Naya followed without question, her bare feet finding secure purchase on rocks that should have been treacherous, her small body navigating the desert terrain with an ease that would have worried any adult watching, but no adults were watching. It was barely dawn, and the town of Dry Bend still slept, unaware that an 8-year-old girl was following a creature of legend deeper into the wilderness than any child should venture alone. The wolf paused at the base of a red rock formation, its head tilted as if listening to voices Naya couldn't hear. Then it began to dig, its powerful claws scraping away layers of sand and stone with determined precision. Naya knelt beside it, her small hands joining the effort, though she had no idea what they were seeking. 20 minutes later, her fingers struck something that wasn't rock or earth. Leather, cracked and brittle with age, wrapped around what felt like papers. The wolf stepped back, watching with those ancient yellow eyes as Naya carefully extracted a bundle from its hiding place. Inside the deteriorating leather pouch were documents, official papers bearing the seal of the United States Army, dated 15 years earlier. The writing was faded, but still legible, and though Naya couldn't read all the words, she recognized some of them. Words like Apache, hostile, and elimination. Words that made her stomach feel hollow and cold, but it was the signature at the bottom that made her breath catch in her throat. Even with her limited reading skills, she could make out the name, Silas Boone, Scout, 3rd Cavalry Regiment. The wolf had led her to evidence of something terrible, something that connected the old man who watched her from his boarding house window to events that had shaped her young life in ways she was only beginning to understand. The animal sat motionless beside her, patient as stone, while she stared at papers that contained truths too heavy for a child's shoulders. When she looked up, the sun was higher, and she could hear voices in the distance, her grandfather calling. Her name, with the particular tone that meant concern, was turning to worry. The wolf rose and began walking back toward town, and Naya followed, clutching the documents against her chest, like a talisman against the growing confusion in her heart. By the time they reached the edge of Dry Bend, the entire settlement seemed to be in motion. People were gathered in small groups, their voices carrying across the morning air with an urgency that made Naya's skin prickle. The wolf melted into the shadows beside a building, and Naya approached her grandfather's house, alone, the papers hidden beneath her simple cotton dress. Naya! Joseph's relief was palpable as she appeared around the corner of their dwelling. He gathered her into his arms with unusual emotion, his weathered hands checking her for injuries. "Where have you been, child?" "I woke, and you were gone." "I was with the wolf, grandfather," she said simply. "It wanted to show me something." Joseph's eyes sharpened, and he looked past her toward the place where the creature had disappeared. "What did it show you?" Naya glanced around, noting the neighbors who had gathered to help search for her and were now dispersing with visible relief. Mrs. Clemens was there, her face pinched with disapproval, and Mr. Williams, the sheriff, who watched Naya with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Something that belongs to the past," she said carefully. "Something hidden." Joseph nodded, understanding passing between them, without need for more words. He would wait until they were alone to learn what the wolf had revealed, but his expression told her he already suspected it would be something that would change everything. The rest of the morning passed in a strange twilight of normalcy. Naya helped with the daily chores, ground corn for the day's meals, and tended to their small garden. But underneath the routine activities, she could feel something building in the town like pressure before a storm. The wolf appeared twice more, before noon, both times in places where it shouldn't have been possible for the same animal to be. Mrs. Johnson saw it behind her hen house, while her husband simultaneously spotted it near the church, a quarter-mile away. The sightings created a ripple of unease that spread through Dry Bend like spilled water. By afternoon, the conversations had taken on a different tone. Words like unnatural and witchcraft began appearing in discussions that had started with concern about a sick animal. The wolf's rapid recovery, combined with its apparent ability to be in multiple places at once, had transformed local skepticism into something approaching fear. Silas Boone stood at his boarding house window, watching the activity below with growing dread. He'd seen the girl return that morning, had noticed the way she'd glanced toward his window before disappearing into her grandfather's house. There had been something different about her posture, a new weight in her small shoulders that suggested she was carrying more than a child should bear. The wolf appeared in the alley beside the boarding house as if materializing from shadow and dust. It looked up at Silas's window with those knowing yellow eyes, and this time there was no mistaking the intelligence there or the judgment. The creature held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked away with the deliberate pace of something that had delivered a message. Silas sank into his room's single chair, his hands shaking as memories he'd spent 15 years suppressing came flooding back. The winter camp beside the frozen creek, the families huddled around their fires, unaware that death was approaching through the morning mist. The orders he'd carried out with the efficiency of a man who believed he was serving justice. He told himself they were hostiles, dangerous renegades who threatened the safety of honest settlers. He'd believed the reports that painted them as savage killers, raiders who showed no mercy to women and children. It had taken years for him to learn the truth, that the camp had been peaceful, that the families had been trying to reach the reservation, that the hostile activity had been fabricated by men who wanted Apache land more than Apache peace. But by then it was too late for anything but regret and the kind of guilt that ate at a man's soul like acid. He'd left the army, drifted west, and tried to build a new life in places where no one knew his name or his history. Dry Bend had seemed like the perfect place to disappear, a town too small and too insignificant for his past to follow him. Now, watching the wolf move through the streets like a ghost made flesh, he realized that some sins were too great for simple geography to wash away. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of red and gold, the first supernatural manifestation occurred. Thomas Mueller, who ran the town's small bank, was closing up his office when he heard children laughing in the alley behind the building. When he investigated, he found nothing but empty space and the lingering scent of sage smoke. But Mary Mueller, working in her kitchen across town, heard the same laughter at the same time and found her own empty yard filled with the same inexplicable fragrance. When the couple compared notes at dinner, they discovered that the voices had sounded like Apache children speaking in a language neither of them understood. Similar incidents were reported throughout the evening. The sound of drums, when no drums, were being played. Shadows that moved independently of their sources, the sensation of being watched by invisible eyes. One by one, the residents of Dry Bend began to understand that something fundamental had changed in their small corner of the world. At the center of it all was the wolf, now fully recovered and moving through the town with the confidence of a creature that belonged there more than the humans who'd built it. It appeared to different people at different times, always watching, always judging, its presence a reminder that some debts could never be fully paid. And in her grandfather's house, Naya sat with the hidden documents spread before her on the earthen floor, slowly spelling out words that told a story of betrayal and violence, of trust broken and innocence destroyed. The papers were more than evidence. They were a map to the truth that the wolf had been sent to reveal. Joseph watched his granddaughter struggle with knowledge that no child should possess, and his heart ached for the burden that had been placed upon her young shoulders. But he also felt a fierce pride in her strength, in her ability to face difficult truths without turning away. "What do the spirits want me to do, grandfather?" she asked, her small fingers tracing the faded ink of Silas. "Boone's signature? They want justice," Joseph replied. "But justice can take many forms, little one. Sometimes it looks like punishment, and sometimes it looks like healing. The spirits will show you which path to choose when the time comes." Outside, the wolf howled once, a sound that echoed across the desert and seemed to reach into the hearts of everyone who heard it, stirring memories and guilt and the terrible weight of unfinished business. The war club had been hidden beneath her grandfather's sleeping mat for as long as Naya could remember, wrapped in faded red cloth and handled only during the most sacred ceremonies. Now it lay before her in the morning light, its carved wooden handle worn smooth by generations of hands, its stone head still sharp enough to split bone. "This belonged to your great-great-grandfather," Joseph said, his voice heavy with the weight of ancestral responsibility. He carried it when the people fought to defend their homeland and when they made the choice to lay down arms for peace. Naya stared at the weapon, understanding intuitively that her grandfather was showing her more than a family heirloom. The war club represented a choice, the same choice that every generation had faced when confronted with injustice. Fight or forgive, strike back or seek healing. "The papers you found," Joseph continued, "they tell a story of violence, but they are only one part of a larger story, one that stretches back through time and forward into a future we cannot yet see." Since discovering the documents 3 days ago, Naya had been struggling with emotions too complex for her 8-year-old mind to fully process. She knew that Silas Boone had done something terrible to her people, something that had cost lives and destroyed families. But she also knew him as the lonely old man who watched her from his window, whose eyes held their own burden of sadness. The wolf had been teaching her, though not through words. When she sat beside it, images would flash through her mind, scenes of violence and loss, but also moments of beauty and connection. She saw her parents, whom she barely remembered, laughing together beside a fire. She saw Apache children playing games that had been passed down for centuries. She saw the interconnectedness of all life, the way actions rippled outward through time like stones thrown into still water. But the visions were becoming stronger, more frequent, and with them came a growing awareness of her own power. Yesterday, she had touched a dying rabbit that had been caught by a neighbor's cat, and under her hands, the creature's wounds had healed completely. The rabbit had looked at her with the same ancient intelligence she saw in the wolf's eyes before bounding away into the desert. The experience had frightened her more than anything else that had happened, because it meant the spirits expected something from her, something important and irreversible. "Grandfather," she said, her small fingers hovering over the war club without quite touching it, "what if I'm not strong enough for what they want me to do?" Joseph knelt beside her, his weathered hands gentle as he guided her fingers to the weapons. "Endel, strength is not about the ability to hurt others, little one. True strength lies in the choice to heal when healing is harder than hurting." Across town, Silas Boone was packing his few belongings into a worn leather satchel, his movements swift and desperate. The nightmares had been getting worse, so vivid that he often woke unsure whether he was still dreaming. Last night, he had found himself standing in the middle of his room at 3 in the morning, dressed and ready to travel, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. The wolf was everywhere now, appearing at moments when Silas felt safest, reminding him that there was no escape from the weight of his actions. He decided to leave Dry Bend, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the creature that seemed to see straight through his soul. But when he reached for his door handle, his hand simply wouldn't turn it. He stood there for several minutes, straining against what felt like invisible bonds, before giving up and returning to his packing. 3 more times he tried to leave, and 3 more times something prevented him from walking out of the room. On the 4th attempt, he found the wolf sitting in the hallway outside his door, blocking his path with casual authority. Its yellow eyes held no hostility, only the patient certainty of a jailer who knew the prisoner wasn't going anywhere. "What do you want from me?" Silas whispered, his voice cracking with 15 years of suppressed guilt. The wolf simply watched him for a moment, then rose and walked away, leaving Silas alone with the growing realization that his attempt to flee had been doomed from the start. Whatever was happening in Dry Bend, whatever reckoning was approaching, he was meant to be part of it. Downtown, the strange incidents were multiplying. Mrs. Henderson had found her kitchen filled with the scent of sage and cedar despite having no such plants anywhere in her house. The banker, Thomas Mueller, had discovered his safe standing open despite being certain he'd locked it the night before, though nothing was missing. Most disturbing were the sounds. Apache words spoken by voices that seemed to come from empty air, children laughing in places where no children played, and underneath it all, the constant sense of being observed by invisible eyes. The town council had called an emergency meeting, and the discussion quickly centered on the wolf and the girl who seemed to control it. Councilman Porter, a red-faced man who owned the largest ranch in the area, was vocal in his concerns. "That animal is the cause of all this supernatural nonsense," he declared, his fist pounding the table for emphasis. "And that Apache girl is practicing some kind of witchcraft. It's time we took action before this gets completely out of hand." Sheriff Williams, who had been notably quiet during the meeting, finally spoke up. "What kind of action are you suggesting, Porter?" "Remove the threat," Porter replied bluntly. "The wolf needs to be destroyed, and the girl needs to be sent to the reservation where she belongs." "She's 8 years old," Williams said quietly, "and she's lived here her entire life." "She's Apache," Porter shot back, "and Apaches don't belong in civilized towns." The argument that followed revealed divisions in the community that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Some residents sided with Porter, viewing the recent supernatural events as confirmation of their worst prejudices. Others, led by the town's doctor and the schoolteacher, argued for tolerance and understanding, but underneath the political and racial tensions was something deeper, a growing recognition that the events in Dry Bend were connected to something in the town's past, something that certain residents would prefer to keep buried. As the meeting grew more heated, none of the participants noticed the small figure standing outside the building's window, or the wolf that sat beside her like a guardian. Naya listened to the angry voices with the solemn attention of someone far older than her years, understanding that the choice between healing and vengeance was approaching faster than anyone realized. That night, the wolf came to her in dreams more vivid than any she'd experienced before. She found herself running through a landscape of memory and spirit, surrounded by Apache warriors who had chosen to lay down their weapons rather than pass their anger to the next generation. They spoke to her in the old language, their words carrying the weight of ancestral wisdom. "The choice will be yours alone," they told her, "but remember that hatred is a fire that burns the one who carries it more than the one it targets. Choose wisely, little daughter. Choose with love." When she woke, the war club was glowing softly in the pre-dawn darkness, its ancient wood warm to the touch despite the morning chill. Naya understood that the weapon's power was not in its ability to harm, but in its capacity to choose a different path, to transform the energy of anger into something that could heal rather than destroy. The spirits were preparing her for something momentous, something that would test not just her courage, but her ability to see beyond the immediate desire for justice to the deeper need for reconciliation. She was 8 years old, but the weight of generations rested on her small shoulders, and the whole town was about to discover just how powerful love could be when wielded by someone pure enough to use it without reservation. Silas's compass had been his most trusted possession during his years as an army scout, a precision instrument that had guided him through thousands of miles of uncharted territory. Now it sat on his small table, its needle spinning wildly before. Settling on a direction that had nothing to do with magnetic north, the compass pointed steadily toward the eastern edge of town, toward the small adobe house where Joseph Running Bear lived with his granddaughter. No matter how Silas moved or turned the instrument, the needle remained fixed on that single bearing, as if pulled by a force stronger than the Earth's magnetic field. He'd tried to leave Dry Bend again that morning, loading his horse and riding toward the main road that led to Tucson. But 3 miles out of town, his mount had simply stopped, refusing to take another step, despite Silas's increasingly desperate urging. When he'd finally turned the horse around, it had walked willingly, back toward town, as if returning home. The message was clear. He wasn't leaving until whatever was happening had run its course. The compass in his hand seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, pointing always toward the truth he'd spent 15 years trying to escape. Down at the trader's post, Ezekiel was dealing with his own supernatural problems. The remaining dogs had begun behaving strangely, gathering in a circle and howling at the same time each morning, their voices raised in what sounded almost like a morning song. More troubling, several townspeople had reported seeing the same dogs in multiple locations, simultaneously, just as they had with the wolf. "It ain't natural," Martha Clemens declared for the 3rd time that week, her voice carrying across the small crowd that had gathered to discuss the situation. "Animals don't act this way unless something evil is influencing them." Dr. Harrison, the town's physician and one of its more educated residents, had been observing the phenomena with scientific curiosity rather than superstitious fear. "There may be a rational explanation," he suggested. "Mass hysteria can cause people to see things that aren't really there." "Then explain this," challenged Porter, pulling a photograph from his coat pocket. "My wife took this yesterday morning." The image was blurry, as most photographs were in those days, but it clearly showed the wolf standing in Porter's yard, while in the background the same creature could be seen near the church. The double exposure should have been impossible, yet there it was, captured on film. Dr. Harrison studied the photograph with the careful attention of a man trying to apply scientific principles to something that defied rational explanation. "There could be multiple animals that look similar, or there could be witchcraft," Porter interrupted, "Apache magic designed to drive us from our homes." The word witchcraft hung in the air like smoke, carrying with it centuries of fear and misunderstanding. Several people in the crowd nodded agreement, their faces reflecting the kind of certainty that comes from having simple explanations for complex problems. But not everyone was convinced. Mrs. Johnson, whose family had been among the first to settle in Dry Bend, spoke up with the authority of someone who'd seen enough frontier hardship to develop perspective. "I've known Joseph Running Bear for 12 years, she said firmly. "He's never caused trouble for anyone in this town. His granddaughter is a sweet child who helps anyone who asks. If strange things are happening, maybe we should ask ourselves, why instead of looking for someone to blame?" Meanwhile, Naya was experiencing the full awakening of her spiritual gifts. The visions came more frequently now, sometimes triggered by touch, sometimes arriving without warning. She would see flashes of the past, Apache families living in harmony with the land, children playing games passed down through generations, hunters offering prayers of gratitude to the animals that gave their lives for sustenance. But increasingly, the visions showed her violence. The attack on the winter camp that had taken her parents' lives, the fear in women's eyes as soldiers approached, the way children had tried to hide behind their mothers, not understanding that death was coming for them all. Most painful of all were the visions of Silas Boone as a young man, his face unmarked by the guilt that now carved lines around his eyes. She saw him leading soldiers through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate, his tracking skills making him invaluable to commanders who cared more about results than methods. The wolf had begun speaking to her, though not in words. When she placed her hands on its silver fur, images and emotions flowed between them like water finding its level. Through this connection, she learned that the creature was not just one spirit, but many. All the Apache souls who had died unjustly, bound together by their shared need for resolution. "They're angry," she told her grandfather that evening as they sat beside their small fire. "But they're also sad. They don't want to hurt people. They just want the truth to be known." Joseph nodded, his weathered face reflecting decades of carrying similar burdens. The spirits of the dead cannot rest until justice is served. But justice and vengeance are not the same thing, little one. The choice of which path to follow will be yours to make. That night, Naya dreamed she was standing in Silas Boone's room, watching him stare at his spinning compass with eyes full of desperation. In the dream, she could see straight through his skin to the guilt that ate at him like a living thing. She understood that his suffering was real, even if it could never equal what he had caused others to endure. When she woke, she knew what the spirits wanted her to do. The wolf was waiting outside her door, its yellow eyes glowing softly in the pre-dawn darkness. Together, they walked through the sleeping town toward the boarding house, where Silas lay trapped by his own conscience. The old scout was awake when they arrived, standing at his window and staring out at the desert as if searching for escape routes that didn't exist. When he saw the girl and the wolf in the alley below, he felt something break open in his chest. 15 years of carefully constructed denial crumbling like a dam made of sand. Naya looked up at his window and spoke, her young voice carrying clearly through the still air. "You cannot run from what you have done, but you can choose what you do now." Silas pressed his forehead against the glass, his breath fogging the window as he struggled with emotions he'd thought long buried. "I was following orders," he whispered, knowing she couldn't hear but needing to say the words anyway. "I believed I was serving justice." As if responding to his unspoken words, the wolf sat back on its haunches and howled, a sound that seemed to contain all the grief and loss of an entire people. The mournful cry echoed across Dry Bend, waking residents and sending chills down spines throughout the settlement. But underneath the sorrow was something else, a note of hope, fragile but unmistakable. The spirits were offering a chance for redemption, though the price would be higher than any worldly currency could measure. Other townspeople began appearing at their windows, drawn by the wolf's call. Mrs. Clemens clutched her shawl around her shoulders and muttered prayers under her breath. Dr. Harrison watched with scientific fascination, still trying to find rational explanations for irrational events. Sheriff Williams stood in his doorway, one hand resting on his gun belt, though he knew no earthly weapon could affect what was happening. And in his boarding house room, Silas Boone made a decision that would change everything. He opened his window and called down to the girl who held his fate in her small hands. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice carrying all the weight of his accumulated guilt. Naya looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "The truth," she said simply. "All of it. The spirits cannot rest until the truth is known." The compass in Silas's hand suddenly stopped spinning, its needle pointing directly down toward the girl and the wolf. He understood then that his years of running were over, that the reckoning he'd both feared and secretly longed for was finally at hand. The question now was whether he had the courage to face what he'd done, to speak aloud the words that would either damn him or set him free. The child's moccasin was no bigger than Naya's palm, its beadwork still bright despite being buried in the desert sand for 15 years. The wolf had led her to this place, a hidden canyon 20 miles from Dry Bend, where winter winds had carved shelter in the red stone walls. This was where it had happened, where families had gathered to escape the harsh winter, believing themselves safe in the embrace of the sacred cliffs, where children had played and laughed until the morning the soldiers came. Naya held the tiny moccasin against her chest, feeling the echo of its young owner's terror and confusion. Through her connection with the wolf, she experienced the massacre, as if she had been there. The thundering of horses' hooves, the crack of gunfire, the screams that had echoed off the canyon walls until even the stones seemed to weep. But more than the violence, she felt the betrayal. These families had been traveling to the reservation, following the white man's rules, trusting in promises of safety that had proven as fragile as morning frost. They had believed that peace was possible, that their children could grow up in a world where Apache and white settler could coexist. that trust had died with them in this hidden canyon, along with any hope that justice would be served for their sacrifice. "I see them," Naya whispered to the wolf, her young voice barely audible above the desert wind. "I see what was lost." The spirit wolf padded deeper into the canyon, leading her to specific spots where the strongest emotional impressions lingered. Here a mother had died shielding her infant son. There, an old man had fallen while trying to protect the ceremonial items that connected his people to their ancestors. In each place, Naya felt the weight of lives cut short, dreams unfulfilled, love interrupted by violence. But she also felt something else, a profound sadness that came not from the victims, but from their killers, the soldiers who had carried out the massacre had not been monsters, merely men following orders they believed to be just. Their leader, a young scout named Silas Boone, had guided them to this place believing he was protecting innocent settlers from Apache raiders. The truth was more complex than either side had understood at the time. Fear and misunderstanding had created a cycle of violence that consumed the guilty and innocent alike, leaving scars that had not healed even after 15 years. As the sun reached its zenith, Naya began to hear voices, not the whispered communications of the spirit wolf, but actual human speech carried on the desert wind, Apache words, spoken with the clarity of the living rather than the ethereal quality of spiritual communication. Joseph emerged from behind a rock formation, followed by 3 other Apache elders, whom Naya recognized from occasional visits to Dry Bend. Her grandfather's face was grave, marked by the special sorrow that comes from returning to places of great loss. "The spirits called us here," Joseph explained, his voice heavy with emotion. "They want witnesses to what you have discovered." The eldest of the visiting Apache, a woman named Maria Crow Feather, knelt beside Naya and examined the small moccasin, with hands that trembled slightly. "This belonged to my sister's daughter," she said softly, "little Sky, who was 4 years old when she died in this place." The other elders spread out through the canyon, each drawn to specific locations where family members had fallen. They moved with the careful reverence of people walking through a graveyard, offering prayers and leaving small offerings of tobacco and sage. "Why did the spirits wait so long to reveal this place?" Naya asked her grandfather. Joseph considered the question carefully before answering. "Because the time was not right before now. The people needed to heal enough to bear witness without seeking vengeance, and you needed to grow strong enough to serve as a bridge between the living and the dead." As if summoned by his words, the wolf appeared at the canyon's entrance, its silver form shimmering in the heat waves rising from the desert floor. Behind it came another figure, Silas Boone, moving with the careful steps of a man who knew he was walking into judgment. The old scout looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were dusty from hard travel, and his face bore the marks of internal struggle. In his hand, he carried something wrapped in cloth, the compass that had led him here, despite his conscious desire to flee. When he saw the Apache elders, Silas stopped walking, his face going pale beneath its weathered tan. These were people he had wronged directly, survivors whose lives he had shattered with his actions. Facing them required a kind of courage he wasn't sure he possessed. "I followed the spirits here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They wouldn't let me run anymore." Maria Crow Feather rose to her feet, her eyes fixed on the man who had guided soldiers to her family's final resting place. For a long moment, the canyon filled with a tension so thick it seemed to have physical weight. Then Naya stepped between them, the child's moccasins still clutched in her small hands. "The spirits don't want more killing," she said, her young voice carrying surprising authority. "They want truth. They want the pain to stop." Through her connection with the wolf, images began flowing into Naya's mind, not just scenes of the massacre, but moments from Silas's life afterward. She saw him waking from nightmares, drinking to forget, wandering from town to town, carrying guilt that grew heavier with each passing year. She saw him helping a family whose wagon had broken down, sharing his food with hungry travelers, performing small acts of kindness that could never balance the weight of his greatest sin, but showed that he was more than the worst thing he had ever done. "Show them," she said to Silas, holding out the moccasin. "Show them what you remember." Silas looked at the tiny beaded shoe, and 15 years of suppressed memories came flooding back. When he began to speak, his voice was rough with unshed tears, but his words were clear and precise, the testimony of a man who had finally found the courage to face his own truth. He told them about the false reports that had justified the attack, about the orders to leave no survivors, about the way the children's faces had haunted him every night since. He spoke of his shame and his failed attempts to atone, of the way guilt had poisoned every day of his life since that terrible morning. When he finished, the canyon fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through the ancient stones. The Apache elders listened without interruption, their faces revealing nothing of their thoughts or intentions. Finally, Maria Crowfeather spoke, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated grief. "You have carried this burden alone for 15 years, but some wounds can only be healed by those who were hurt the most." She looked toward Naya, understanding passing between the generations, like a torch being passed from hand to hand. The choice of how to respond to Silas's confession would belong to the child who carried the spirits of the dead within her small frame. The wolf stepped forward, its yellow eyes moving between Naya and Silas, with an expression that somehow conveyed both judgment and hope. The moment of decision was approaching, and with it, the possibility of healing that could transform both communities, or the risk of choosing vengeance that would perpetuate the cycle of pain for another generation. The sacred sage bundle had belonged to Joseph's father, blessed by medicine men, whose names were now remembered only in ceremony and prayer. Joseph held it carefully as he prepared for what might be his final ritual, the dried herbs crackling softly between his weathered fingers. "The spirits grow restless," he told the assembled elders in the canyon. "The boundary between worlds is thinning. Soon the dead will walk among us as freely as the living, and when that happens, there will be no controlling what follows." Naya could feel it too, a building pressure in the air around them, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched beyond its natural limits. The wolf had grown more solid somehow, its spirit form taking on substance and weight that left actual paw prints in the sand, but it was no longer alone. Shadowy figures had begun appearing at the edges of vision, translucent forms that became clearer with each passing hour. Apache warriors who had died in the massacre, women who had fallen protecting their children, elders who had carried the wisdom of generations to their graves. They stood at the canyon's perimeter like sentinels, waiting for something that only Naya could provide. Back in Dry Bend, the town was experiencing supernatural phenomena that could no longer be dismissed or explained away. Voices spoke from empty rooms. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees whenever the sun went down, regardless of the season. Mrs. Clemens had barricaded herself in her boarding house, convinced that Apache witchcraft was preparing to destroy the entire settlement. But others, led by Dr. Harrison and Sheriff Williams, had begun to suspect that the supernatural events were connected to something in the town's past, something that certain long-time residents had never spoken about. The trader, Ezekiel, had packed his wagon and attempted to leave town, but his horses had refused to cross the settlement's boundaries, rearing and screaming as if facing an invisible wall. When he'd tried to proceed on foot, he'd found himself walking in circles, always ending up back at the sign that had started everything. "Take any dog for free." The dogs themselves had disappeared entirely, vanishing one by one until only their howls remained, echoing through the streets at all hours of the day and night. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a constant reminder that the natural order had been fundamentally disturbed. In the canyon, Joseph lit the sage. Bundle and sweet smoke began rising toward the azure sky. The scent seemed to call the spirits closer, their forms becoming more solid and defined with each passing moment. The ceremony must be completed before sunset, he told Naya, his voice urgent with concern. If the spirits are not given resolution, by then they will remain trapped between worlds indefinitely, and their pain will consume everything around them. Naya looked toward Silas, who sat apart from the group with his head bowed and his hands clasped around his compass. The instrument had stopped pointing toward truth and now spun wildly, reflecting the chaos building in the spiritual realm. "What must I do, grandfather?" she asked. "You must choose," Joseph replied simply. "The spirits offer two paths: justice through punishment, which will give them peace but perpetuate the cycle of violence, or justice through forgiveness, which is harder but offers the possibility of true healing." The Apache elders had formed a circle around the canyon's center, their voices joining in a chant that seemed to resonate with the very stones themselves. As they sang, the spirits of the dead became fully visible, no longer translucent but solid and real as any living person. Naya recognized faces from her visions: the young mother who had died protecting her baby, the old warrior who had fallen. While defending the ceremonial objects, the child whose moccasins still rested in her hands. They looked at her with expressions of infinite sadness, but also profound hope, as if she represented their only chance for peace. But among the Apache spirits stood others, soldiers who had participated in the massacre, their faces marked by guilt and regret. They too were trapped, bound to this place by the weight of their actions, unable to find rest until the cycle of violence was broken. "They all suffer," Naya realized, her young voice filled with wonder and compassion. "The ones who died and the ones who killed. The spirits are all connected by pain." The wolf approached her, its yellow eyes reflecting depths of wisdom accumulated over countless years. When she placed her hands on its silver fur, images flooded her mind, not just of the massacre, but of all the violence that had preceded and followed it. Apache raids on settler families, retaliatory attacks on Apache camps, a spiral of hatred and fear that had consumed both communities for generations. At the center of it all was a simple truth: everyone involved had been trying to protect what they loved, but fear had twisted their protection into aggression, their love into hate. Silas rose from his place at the canyon's edge, walking slowly toward the circle of spirits with his compass held before him like an offering. The needle had stopped spinning and now pointed directly at Naya, recognizing her as the only person with the power to provide the truth he sought. "I offer my life in payment for what I've done," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "If my death will give them peace, I accept that judgment." But Naya shook her head, understanding finally what the spirits truly wanted. "Death is easy," she said, her young voice filled with wisdom beyond her years. "Living with the truth is harder. Living to make things right is the greatest justice of all." She looked around the circle of spirits, meeting each gaze with the fearless compassion of a child who had chosen love over anger. "I forgive you," she said to Silas, "not because what you did was right, but because forgiveness is the only thing strong enough to break the cycle." As the words left her lips, something fundamental shifted in the canyon. The sage smoke began glowing with its own light, and the spirits of the dead started to shimmer, as if seen through rising heat. They were being released, their pain transformed into something that could heal rather than destroy. But the ceremony was not yet complete. The spirits had one final gift to offer, a vision of what Dry Bend could become if both communities chose reconciliation over revenge, understanding over fear. Through Naya's eyes, everyone present saw a future where Apache and white settler worked together, where children of all backgrounds played the same games, where the mistakes of the past became lessons for building a better tomorrow. The vision was beautiful but fragile, dependent on choices that had not yet been made by people who were still trapped in old patterns of mistrust and hatred. Whether that future would come to pass would depend on what happened when they returned to Dry Bend, and whether a town built on secrets was ready to face the truth about its own foundation. The Apache peace treaty was yellowed with age, its edges brittle as autumn leaves, but the official seals and signatures were still clearly visible. Silas's hands trembled as he unwrapped the document he'd carried for 15 years, the secret that had eaten at his conscience more than even his memories of the massacre. "This is why they really sent us to the canyon," he said, his voice hollow with the weight of confession. "Not because your people were raiders, because someone wanted the land that had been promised to the Apache nation." Joseph took the treaty with reverence due to sacred objects, his eyes scanning the formal language that had meant so much and delivered so little. The document was dated 6 months before the massacre, signed by Apache chiefs and United States representatives, guaranteeing safe passage to reservation lands and protection for families making the journey. "We followed the treaty," Maria Crowfeather said, her voice heavy with betrayal that had festered for 15 years. "Our people trusted the white man's paper. We believed in the promises written here." Naya watched the adults pass the document. Between them, understanding intuitively that this piece of paper represented more than broken promises. It was evidence of a deliberately orchestrated betrayal that had cost dozens of lives for the sake of mineral rights and railroad expansion. But as she studied the treaty, the wolf beside her began to change. Its silver form shimmered and expanded, becoming something larger and more complex than a single animal spirit. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. What had appeared to be one wolf was revealing itself as many. The collective spirit of all who had died unjustly, bound together by their shared need for justice. The spirits of the massacre victims stepped forward, their forms becoming clearer and more substantial with each passing moment. But they were not alone. Other figures began materializing, Apache warriors who had fallen in battles stretching back generations, settlers who had died in retaliatory raids, soldiers who had perished far from home in a war they'd never fully understood. "We are all connected," the wolf spirit spoke, its voice carrying the weight of countless souls. "Every act of violence creates ripples that spread through time. Every death demands answers that the living are not ready to give." Naya felt the full scope of what she was facing crash over her like a wave. This was not just about one massacre or one broken treaty. The spirits represented generations of conflict, cycles of revenge that had poisoned the relationship between Apache and white communities for decades. But among the spirits of the dead stood one figure that made Naya's breath catch in her throat. Her grandfather Joseph, though he was very much alive and standing beside her in the physical world. "Grandfather," she whispered, looking between the living man and his spiritual double. The spirit. Joseph smiled sadly. "I have been serving as a bridge between worlds for many years, little one. My spirit has been partially joined with theirs, helping to hold them in balance until you were ready to take on this burden." The living Joseph confirmed this with a nod, his face showing the strain of carrying such a responsibility. "The spirits came to me when you were very young, asking me to prepare you for this moment. But the cost of serving as their anchor has been my life force. I am dying, Naya, have been for months." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Her grandfather, the man who had raised her and taught her everything she knew about their heritage, was sacrificing his life to keep the spirits from overwhelming the world of the living. All this time, he had been protecting not just her, but everyone in Dry Bend from a supernatural catastrophe that would have consumed both communities. "But there is hope," the spirit Joseph continued. "The treaty that Silas has revealed can restore what was stolen. Land rights can be returned. Official recognition can be given to the injustices that were committed. The dead can find peace if The living choose to honor their memory with action, rather than just words. Silas stepped forward, his face pale but determined. I've been protecting this treaty all these years because I knew that revealing it would expose corruption that went all the way to Washington. Politicians and railroad barons conspired to break legal agreements for their own profit. They used men like me as tools to do their dirty work. He pulled out additional documents from his coat, correspondence between military commanders and civilian authorities, orders that had been classified for national security reasons, evidence of a conspiracy that had used the massacre as a convenient way to invalidate inconvenient legal obligations. If these papers are made public, the government will have to honor the original treaty terms, Silas continued. Apache families will get their land back. Compensation will be paid. The truth will finally be known. But as he spoke, the spiritual tension in the canyon continued to build. The wolf spirit was growing larger and more complex, its form now encompassing dozens of individual spirits who had been bound together by trauma and unfinished business. The collective entity radiated power that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential energy. The choice is before you, Bridgewalker, the wolf spirit said to Naya. You can release us through forgiveness, allowing the legal justice to unfold naturally, or you can bind us to your will and use our combined power to ensure that justice is swift and complete. The second option carried terrible temptation. With the power of the collective spirit, Naya could force recognition of Apache rights, could compel the government to honor its treaties, could even extract retribution from those who had profited from genocide. She would become a living weapon of supernatural justice, capable of righting wrongs that had persisted for generations. But she would also become something other than human, forever changed by the responsibility of wielding the power of the dead. The spirits would find peace, but she would take their place as a guardian between worlds, sacrificing her childhood and her future for the sake of justice. What happens to grandfather if I choose forgiveness? She asked. The spirit, Joseph's expression, grew sad. I will die as I was meant to months ago. But I will die at peace, knowing that the spirits have found their rest and that you are free to live your own life. And if I choose to bind the spirits to myself, then I will live, sustained by the power you channel. But you will become what? I have been a bridge between worlds, forever carrying the weight of the dead. The choice was impossible and perfect in its impossibility. Save her grandfather and sacrifice her future, or let him die naturally and free herself to grow up as a normal child. Justice achieved through supernatural power, or justice sought through human means with no guarantee of success. As Naya wrestled with the decision, the living and the dead watched in silence, understanding that the fate of both communities rested in the hands of an 8-year-old girl who had never asked for such responsibility but had been chosen by forces beyond human comprehension. The wolf spirit waited patiently, its yellow eyes reflecting depths of wisdom and power that could reshape the world if properly directed. But underneath the supernatural majesty, Naya could still see the simple truth that had brought her to this moment. Sometimes the greatest power comes from choosing love over fear, healing over revenge, forgiveness over the satisfaction of justified anger. The sun was beginning to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold. Soon the ceremony would reach its conclusion, and whatever choice Naya made would become irreversible. The spirits of the dead would find their rest or remain bound to earth. The truth about the massacre would emerge or stay hidden, and a young girl would either step into her destiny as a supernatural guardian or walk away from power beyond imagination. In her hands, she still held the child's moccasin, a reminder that at the heart of all the politics and supernatural manifestations was the simple human cost of violence, the lives that had been lost and the futures that had been stolen. Whatever she decided, it would be for them. The sacred fire burned with flames of impossible colors, blue and silver and deep purple, as if the very essence of the spirit world was being consumed as fuel. Joseph had built it in the center of the canyon using wood from trees that had been blessed by Apache medicine men generations ago, timber that had been kept sacred for ceremonies that bridged the gap between earth and sky. "The fire will burn until dawn," he told the assembled witnesses, his voice growing weaker with each word. "By sunrise, the spirits must be given their final rest, or they will remain trapped between worlds forever. The choice cannot be delayed any longer." Naya sat before the multicolored flames, feeling their supernatural heat wash over her in waves that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the accumulated power of the dead. The wolf spirit had positioned itself beside her, no longer disguising its true nature as a collective entity of dozens of souls bound together by trauma and unfinished business. Around the canyon's perimeter, the spirits of the dead had arranged themselves in a great circle. Apache families who had died in the massacre, soldiers who had carried out orders they later regretted, other victims of the long conflict between settler and native communities. They watched in silence, their translucent forms flickering in the sacred fire's strange light. The living participants had divided themselves into two groups. Joseph and the Apache elders sat on one side of the fire, their faces reflecting the solemn gravity of men and women who understood they were witnessing something that would reshape their understanding of life and death. On the other side, Silas sat alone. The treaty documents spread before him like an offering to powers beyond human comprehension. But they were not the only living witnesses to the ceremony. As the afternoon had progressed, other figures had begun. Arriving at the canyon, people from Dry Bend who had been drawn by forces they couldn't name or understand. Sheriff Williams had been the first to arrive, followed by Dr. Harrison and several townspeople who had begun experiencing supernatural phenomena in their own homes. They came not as skeptics or enemies, but as souls seeking answers to questions they hadn't known how to ask. Mrs. Clemens arrived with her husband, her face pale but determined. She had spent days hiding from the supernatural events plaguing the town, but something in the sacred fire's distant glow had called to her conscience, forcing her to confront truths she had spent years avoiding. "I knew," she said, when she saw the treaty documents, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband was on the town council 15 years ago when the railroad company made their offer. We all knew the Apache families were traveling under government protection, but the money they offered, it seemed like salvation for a dying town." Her husband nodded miserably, adding his own confession to the growing pile of guilt and complicity. "We told ourselves the Apache were planning attacks anyway. We convinced ourselves we were just protecting our families, but we knew. Deep down, we all knew." Other townspeople began sharing their own pieces of the conspiracy, how they had provided information about Apache movements to the military, how they had looked the other way when supplies meant for reservation families went missing, how they had benefited from land sales that followed the massacre. The truth that emerged was more complex than simple military aggression or Apache resistance. The massacre had been the culmination of a systematic campaign of deception and betrayal, with ordinary people making small compromises that had added up to extraordinary evil. As the confessions continued, the spirits of the dead began to react. Some grew brighter, as if the acknowledgement of truth was already beginning to heal their wounds. Others became more agitated, their forms flickering with the intensity of anger that had been building for 15 years. The wolf spirit remained calm at the center of it all, its yellow eyes reflecting depths of wisdom that transcended individual emotion. Through her connection with the collective entity, Naya could feel the competing desires of the spirits, some longing for vengeance, others seeking only acknowledgement of their suffering, a few already moving toward forgiveness. "They are not all in agreement," she told her grandfather. "Some of the spirits want to punish those who wronged them. Others just want to be remembered. A few are ready to let go of their anger entirely." Joseph nodded weakly, his life force continuing to ebb as he maintained his role as anchor between worlds. "That is why the choice must be yours, little one. You are the only one pure enough to speak for all of them, to find the path that serves justice without perpetuating the cycle of violence." As the sun continued its descent toward the western horizon, the supernatural pressure in the canyon continued to build. The boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was dissolving completely, creating a space where both existed simultaneously. Silas rose from his place beside the fire, moving slowly toward Naya with his compass held before him. The instrument was glowing now, its needle pointing steadily toward the girl who held the power to determine his fate and the fate of everyone who had been touched by the massacre. "I offer everything I am to make this right." The transformation began with light, pure silver radiance that seemed to emanate from within the wolf spirit's form as it revealed its true nature to all who watched. What had appeared to be a single creature expanded and separated, becoming a constellation of individual spirits, each one glowing with the accumulated love and pain of a life cut short. Naya found herself surrounded by luminous beings who had once been Apache families, soldiers seeking redemption, children who had never grown to adulthood, elders who had carried wisdom to their graves. They stood in a great circle around the sacred fire, their forms beautiful and terrible in their otherworldly majesty, waiting for her decision with the patience of those who had already learned that death was not an ending, but a transformation. The center of the gathering, the collective spirit that had called itself the wolf, maintained its form while revealing the truth of what it represented. It was not just the guardian of Apache souls, but the embodiment of all who had died unjustly in the long conflict between settler and native communities. A repository of pain that had been seeking resolution for generations. "We have waited so long for someone pure enough to hear us," the spirit spoke, its voice carrying the harmony of dozens of individual souls speaking in unison. "You see us not as we were in life, divided by the circumstances of our deaths, but as we are in spirit, united by our common humanity." Through her connection with the collective entity, Naya experienced the full weight of their accumulated suffering. She felt the terror of families under attack, the confusion of soldiers following orders they didn't understand, the grief of survivors who had lost everything they held dear. But she also felt their love for each other, for the land they had called home, for the children they had hoped would inherit a better world. "You offer me great power," she said, her young voice steady despite the magnitude of what she faced. But power to do what? To force people to change their hearts, to compel justice through fear rather than understanding." The spirit form of her grandfather stepped forward, his translucent face filled with infinite compassion. "The choice between love and power is the choice every generation must make, little one. Power can achieve justice quickly, but love can achieve transformation that lasts forever." Around the canyon, the living witnesses watched in awed silence as the supernatural drama unfolded. They could see the spirits clearly now, recognizing faces from old photographs and faded memories. Mrs. Clemens wept as she identified the Apache woman who had sometimes sold beadwork in the town market, always greeting everyone with kindness despite the suspicion she often faced. Dr. Harrison found himself looking into the eyes of a young soldier he had treated for dysentery years ago, a boy barely 18 who had died of fever 3 months. After the massacre, his last words a confession of guilt that the doctor had dismissed as delirium. Sheriff Williams recognized his own predecessor, a man who had resigned his position shortly after the massacre and died of drink within 2 years, carrying secrets that had poisoned his soul until his body could no longer sustain the burden. They are all connected, Naya realized, her understanding expanding to encompass the full scope of what she was witnessing. Every death created ripples that affected everyone around them. The violence didn't end with the massacre. It spread, like poison through both communities, creating more pain, more guilt, more need for healing. The collective spirit nodded, its form shimmering with approval. You see truly, Bridgewalker. This is why the choice cannot be made in anger or haste. The power we offer could compel acknowledgement of wrongdoing, could force reparations and recognition, but it would also create fear and resentment that would poison future generations. Silas rose from his position beside the fire, his face illuminated by the supernatural radiance surrounding them. I offer myself as witness to the truth, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. Not just to what I did, but to what I learned afterward. Let my confession be the beginning of healing rather than the end of hiding. He pulled out the treaty documents and held them toward the assembled spirits. These papers prove that the massacre was orchestrated by men who valued profit over human life, but they also prove that justice delayed is not justice denied. The legal obligations still exist. The land rights can still be restored. The wrongs can still be acknowledged. The spirits began to move, flowing like luminous water toward the papers in Silas's hands. As each one touched the documents, they became more solid, more real, imbuing the legal language with spiritual authority that transcended human law. The papers will carry our witness, the collective spirit explained to Naya, but only if you choose to release us freely without binding us to your will. The choice must come from love, not from the desire to control the outcome. Naya looked around the circle of spirits, seeing in each face the reflection of choices made in fear, anger, or desperation. They had all been shaped by the violence that had torn their communities apart, but in death they had found something that had eluded them in life, the understanding that healing required letting go of the need to be right, to be vindicated, to see others punished for their wrongs. The moment of ultimate decision had arrived, and with it the weight of responsibility that would shape not just her own future, but the future of everyone touched by the long history of conflict between their peoples. The tears that began falling from Naya's eyes were unlike any that had ever been shed in that canyon. They fell as drops of pure light, each one carrying the weight of forgiveness, freely given, love chosen over revenge, healing embraced over the satisfaction of justified anger. As they touched the ground, the earth itself seemed to glow softly, as if being blessed by forces beyond human understanding. I choose forgiveness, she said, her young voice carrying across the canyon with the authority of absolute conviction, not because what was done was right, but because love is stronger than hate, because healing is more important than revenge, because the future matters more than the past. The transformation was immediate and profound. The spirits of the dead began to ascend, their forms becoming brighter and more translucent as the bonds that had held them to earth dissolved. But before they departed, each one approached Naya to offer their own blessing, their own gift of gratitude for the choice she had made. The Apache mother who had died protecting her child knelt before Naya and placed ghostly hands on her shoulders. "You have chosen the path of the peacemaker," she whispered. "May you always remember that the strongest warriors are those who fight for understanding rather than victory." The old warrior who had fallen defending sacred objects pressed something invisible into Naya's palms, the spiritual essence of courage that would sustain her through the challenges ahead. "Carry our strength with you, little daughter. Use it to build bridges where others would dig trenches." One by one, the spirits offered their final gifts: wisdom, compassion, the memory of love that transcends death, the understanding that justice and mercy can coexist when guided by pure intention. As each blessing was given, Naya felt herself changing, not into something supernatural, but into something more fully human than she had been before. The soldier spirits came forward as well, their forms bright with gratitude for the forgiveness they had never dared hope to receive. They too offered gifts, the knowledge of regret that comes too late, the understanding of how good intentions can be corrupted by fear, the wisdom that comes from facing the full weight of one's actions. Silas watched in wonder as the young private, who had died of fever after the massacre, approached him, with eyes full of compassion rather than accusation. "We carry the burden together now," the spirit soldier said, "not as punishment, but as responsibility. Help them understand that we were all victims of forces larger than ourselves." The collective spirit that had appeared as the wolf remained. Longest, its form encompassing all the others, even as they began their final ascent. "The treaty will carry our witness," it told the assembled living. "But more than that, it will carry the power of reconciliation, freely chosen. What you build from this moment forward will be blessed by the prayers of those who have gone before." As the spirit spoke, the treaty documents in Silas's hands began to glow with their own light. The legal language remained unchanged, but the paper itself had been transformed into something more than a historical artifact. It had become a living document, imbued with spiritual authority that no earthly court could ignore. Joseph's spirit form approached his granddaughter for the final time, his face radiant with pride and love. "You have chosen well, little one. The burden I carried is lifted, and the spirits find their rest. I go to join them in peace, knowing that you will carry our people's wisdom into a future brighter than any we dared imagine." "Will I see you again, grandfather?" Naya asked, her voice small despite the magnitude of what she had accomplished. "In every sunset over the sacred mountains," he replied. "In every story told to preserve our heritage. In every act of kindness that bridges the gap between different peoples. I will be there, watching over you with love that death cannot diminish." The living Joseph, still sitting beside the sacred fire, drew his final breath as his spirit completed its ascension. His passing was peaceful, marked not by sadness, but by a profound sense of completion. He had fulfilled his role as guardian and guide, and his granddaughter was ready to face the future with wisdom earned through the hardest choice of all. As the last of the spirits disappeared into the star-filled sky, the sacred fire began to burn with normal colors again. The supernatural pressure that had built in the canyon for days dissipated like morning mist, leaving behind only the quiet satisfaction of justice served through love rather than force. The treaty documents continued to glow softly in Silas's hands, their spiritual authority undeniable to anyone who looked upon them. But more important than their legal power was what they represented. Proof that healing was possible even in the aftermath of great trauma, that forgiveness could coexist with accountability, that love was indeed stronger than hate when wielded by those pure enough to use it without reservation. In the distance, the lights of Dry Bend flickered peacefully, unaware that their community had just been forever changed by the choice of an 8-year-old girl who had looked into the face of ultimate power and chosen compassion instead. The real work of healing would begin with tomorrow's sunrise, but the foundation had been laid in forgiveness freely given and justice sought through understanding rather than revenge. The wolf was gone, but its lesson remained, that sometimes the greatest strength comes from choosing love when every instinct calls for war. The smooth stone fit perfectly in Naya's palm, worn to silky perfection by desert winds and blessed by ceremonies that reached back through generations. She had found it in the canyon, where her grandfather's spirit had joined the others in their final ascent, and somehow she knew it was meant to mark this moment, the transformation of a place of sorrow into a garden of remembrance. 6 months had passed since the night of the sacred fire, and Dry Bend had become something no one could have imagined, a community where Apache and white families worked side by side, where children of all backgrounds played together in the streets, where the painful lessons of the past had been transformed into wisdom for building a better future. The memorial garden bloomed in the place where the old trader's sign had stood, where Naya had first chosen to see past fear to the pain that connected all living things. Desert wildflowers grew in patterns that honored both Apache tradition and settler heritage, their colors bright against the backdrop of red stone and endless sky. Silas Boone knelt beside a small plaque that bore the names of everyone who had died in the massacre, his weathered hands placing fresh sage and wildflowers at its base. The confession he had made that night in the canyon had indeed changed everything, not just for Dry Bend, but for the entire territory. The treaty documents, imbued with spiritual authority that no court could deny, had been presented to territorial officials who found themselves compelled to honor agreements that had been ignored for 15 years. Apache families had been granted the land rights promised in the original treaty, along with compensation for the years of illegal occupation. More importantly, the truth about the massacre had been officially acknowledged. A monument now stood in the territorial capital, bearing the names of the victims and the full story of the conspiracy that had led to their deaths. Silas had testified before Congress, his detailed account helping to expose corruption that reached from local officials to Washington politicians. But the greatest change was in the daily life of Dry Bend itself. The school that had once been for white children only now welcomed students of all backgrounds, with Naya serving as a bridge between cultures, helping Apache children adjust to formal education while teaching their white classmates about traditions that stretched back centuries. Mrs. Clemens, her face softened by months of genuine remorse and active effort to make amends, had become one of the most vocal advocates for integration. Her boarding house now welcomed Apache travelers, and she had learned enough of the language to greet her guests with proper respect. Dr. Harrison had established a clinic that served both communities equally, his medical knowledge combined with traditional Apache healing practices to create treatments that honored multiple approaches to wellness. The collaboration had led to breakthrough treatments for desert illnesses that had plagued the region for generations. Even the railroad, which had profited from the original conspiracy, had been compelled to provide jobs and fair compensation to Apache workers. The station that had once symbolized the encroachment of white civilization now served as a meeting place where different cultures could interact with mutual respect. Naya had grown during these months, not just in age, but in the kind of wisdom that comes from facing impossible choices and choosing love over fear. She still missed her grandfather terribly, but she had learned to feel his presence in the wind that carried the scent of sage across the desert, in the stories passed down through generations, in every act of kindness that bridged differences between people. The wolf appeared to her sometimes, no longer the tortured collective spirit of the dead, but a peaceful guardian that watched over the community with gentle yellow eyes. Children from both cultures had learned to recognize its presence as a blessing, a sign that the spirits of their ancestors were pleased with the choice to heal rather than perpetuate ancient wounds. "You have done well, little bridge-walker," the wolf had told her during its last visit, its spirit form shimmering in the moonlight beside her grandfather's grave. "The path you chose has created ripples that will spread far beyond this small corner of the world. Other communities will learn from what happened here. Other children will grow up believing that peace is possible." On this particular morning, as she placed the smooth stone at the base of the Memorial Garden's central fountain, Naya reflected on how much had changed since that day when she had first knelt beside a dying wolf and seen past its fearsome exterior to the pain that called for healing. Dry Bend had become a place of pilgrimage for people seeking to understand how communities divided by violence could find their way back to wholeness. Delegations came from other territories where settler and native populations struggled with similar conflicts, hoping to learn the lessons that had transformed a frontier town built on secrets into a model of reconciliation. The story spread through newspapers and official reports, but more importantly, it spread through the oral traditions of both cultures. Apache storytellers who carried the tale to distant reservations, and white settlers who shared it around campfires and in letters to family back east. Naya had become a young teacher and storyteller herself, traveling with groups of adults to share what she had learned about forgiveness, justice, and the power of choosing love when every instinct called for revenge. Her youth gave her words special authority. If an 8-year-old girl could choose healing over hatred, what excuse did adults have for perpetuating cycles of violence? As the sun rose over the memorial garden, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Naya felt the presence of all who had gone before, Apache ancestors who had chosen peace over war, soldiers who had found redemption through truth-telling, ordinary people who had discovered that extraordinary healing was possible when communities chose to face their darkest moments with courage and compassion. The smooth stone caught the morning light, its surface reflecting back not just the sun's rays, but the promise of a future where children would grow up believing that different peoples could live together in harmony, where the mistakes of the past would serve as lessons rather than excuses for continued conflict. In the distance, Apache and white children played together in the schoolyard, their laughter carrying across the desert air like a song of hope. They would inherit a world that Naya's choice had helped create, a world where love had proven stronger than hate, where forgiveness had opened doors that vengeance would have sealed forever, where an 8-year-old girl's tears of compassion had watered the seeds of lasting peace. The wolf howled once in the distance, a sound of blessing rather than mourning, and Naya smiled as she walked back toward town, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring with the wisdom of her ancestors and the hope of a future bright with possibility.